Sixth subplane, the second heaven. The dominant characteristic of this subdivision may be said to be anthropomorphic religious devotion. The distinction between such devotion and the religious feeling which finds its expression on the second subplane of the astral lies in the fact that the former is purely unselfish, the man who feels it being totally unconcerned as to what the result of his devotion may be as regards himself, while the latter is always aroused by the hope and desire of gaining some advantage through it, so that on the second astral subplane, such religious feeling as is there active invariably contains an element of selfish bargaining, while the devotion which raises a man to this sixth subplane of the heaven world is entirely free from any such taint. On the other hand, this phase of devotion, which consists essentially in the perpetual adoration of a personal deity, must be carefully distinguished from those still higher forms which find their expression in performing some definite work for the deity's sake. A few examples of the cases observed on this subplane will perhaps show these distinctions more clearly than any mere description can do. A fairly large number of entities whose mental activities work themselves out on this level are drawn from the Oriental religions, but only those are included who have the characteristic of pure but comparatively unreasoning and unintelligent devotion. Worshippers of Vishnu, both in his avatar of Krishna and otherwise, as well as a few followers of Shiva, are to be found here, each wrapped up in the self-woven cocoon of his own thoughts, alone with his own God, and oblivious of the rest of mankind, except in so far as his affections may associate with him in his adoration those whom he loved on earth. A Vaishnavite, for example, was noticed wholly absorbed in the ecstatic worship of the very same image of Vishnu to which he had made offerings during life. Some of the most characteristic examples of this plane are to be found among women, who indeed form a very large majority of its inhabitants. Among others, there was a Hindu woman who had glorified her husband into a divine being, and also thought of the child Krishna as playing with her own children. But while these latter were thoroughly human and real, the child Krishna was obviously nothing but the semblance of a blue wooden image galvanized into life. Krishna also appeared in her heaven under another form, that of an effeminate young man playing on a flute, but she was not in the least confused or troubled by this double manifestation. Another woman, who was a worshipper of Shiva, had confounded the god with her husband, looking upon the latter as a manifestation of the former, so that the one seemed to be constantly changing into the other. Some Buddhists also are found upon this subdivision, but apparently exclusively those less instructed ones who regard the Buddha rather as an object of adoration than as a great teacher. The Christian religion also contributes many of the inhabitants of this plane, the unintellectual devotion which is exemplified on the one hand by the illiterate Roman Catholic peasant, and on the other by the earnest and sincere soldier of the Salvation Army, seems to produce results very similar to those already described. For these people also are found wrapped up in contemplation of their ideas of Christ or his mother, respectively. For instance, an Irish peasant was seen absorbed in the deepest adoration of the Virgin Mary, whom he imaged as standing on the moon after the fashion of Titian's Assumption, but holding out her hands and speaking to him. A medieval monk was found in ecstatic contemplation of Christ crucified, and the intensity of his yearning love and pity was such that as he watched the blood dropping from the wounds of the figure of his Christ, the stigmata reproduced themselves upon his own mind-body. Another man seemed to have forgotten the sad story of the crucifixion and thought of his Christ only as glorified on his throne, with the crystal sea before him, and all around a vast multitude of worshippers, among whom he himself stood with his wife and family. His affection for these relatives was very deep, yet his thoughts were more occupied in adoration of the Christ, though his conception of his deity was so material that he imaged him as constantly changing kaleidoscopically backwards and forwards between the form of a man and that of the lamb, bearing the flag which we often see represented in church window. A more interesting case was that of a Spanish nun who had died at about the age of 19 or 20. In her heaven, she carried herself back to the date of Christ's life upon earth and imagined herself as accompanying him through the chain of events recounted in the Gospels, and after his crucifixion, taking care of his mother, the Virgin Mary. Not unnaturally, perhaps, her pictures of the scenery and costumes of Palestine were entirely inaccurate, for the Saviour and his disciples wore the dress of Spanish peasants, while the hills round Jerusalem were mighty mountains clothed with vineyards, and the olive trees were hung with grey Spanish moss. She thought of herself as eventually martyred for her faith and ascending into heaven, but yet only to live over and over again this life in which she so delighted. A quaint and pretty little example of the heaven life of a child may conclude our list of instances from this subplane. He had died at the age of 7 and was occupied in reenacting in the heaven world the religious stories which his Irish nurse had told him down here. And best of all, he loved to think of himself as playing with the infant Jesus and helping him to make those clay sparrows which the power of the Christ child is fabled to have brought to life and caused to fly. It will be seen that the blind, unreasoning devotion of which we have been speaking does not at any time raise its votaries to any great spiritual heights, but it must be remembered that in all cases they are entirely happy and most fully satisfied, for what they receive is always the highest which they are capable of appreciating. Nor is it without a very good effect on their future career, for although no amount of mere devotion such as this will ever develop intellect, yet it does produce an increased capacity for a higher form of devotion, and in most cases it leads also to purity of life. A person, therefore, who lives such a life and enjoys such a heaven as we have been describing, though he is not likely to make rapid progress on the path of spiritual development, is at least guarded from many dangers, for it is very improbable that in his next birth he should fall into any of the grosser sins, or be drawn away from his devotional aspirations into a mere worldly life of avarice, ambition, or dissipation. Nevertheless, a survey of this subplane distinctly emphasizes the necessity of following St. Peter's advice: add to your faith virtue, and to virtue knowledge. Since such strange results seem to follow from crude forms of faith, one looks with interest to see what effect is produced by the still cruder materialism which not long ago was painfully common in Europe. Madame Blavatsky has stated in The Key to Theosophy that in some cases a materialist has no conscious life in the heaven world, since he did not while on earth believe in such a post-mortem condition. It seems probable, however, that our great founder was employing the word materialist in a much more restricted sense than that in which it is generally used, since in the same volume she also asserts that for them no conscious life after death is possible at all, whereas it is a matter of common knowledge among those whose nightly work lies upon the astral plane that many of those whom we usually call materialists are to be met with there, and are certainly not unconscious. For example, a prominent materialist, intimately known to one of our members, was not long ago discovered by his friend upon the highest subplane of the astral, where he had surrounded himself with his books, and was continuing his studies almost as he might have done on earth. On being questioned by his friend, he readily admitted that the theories which he had held while upon earth were confuted by the irresistible logic of facts, but his own agonist tendencies were still strong enough to make him unwilling to accept what his friend told him as to the existence of the still higher mental plane. Yet there was certainly much in this man's character which could find its full fruition only upon that mental plane. And since his entire disbelief in any life after death has not prevented his astral experiences, there seems no reason to suppose that it can check the due working out of the higher forces in him, in the heaven world hereafter. Assuredly, he has lost much by his disbelief. No doubt, had he been able to understand the beauty of the religious idol, it would have called forth in him a mighty energy of devotion, the effect of which he would have been reaping now. All that which might have been his is missing, but his deep unselfish family affection, his earnest and tireless philanthropic effort, these also were great outpourings of energy, which must produce their result, and can produce it nowhere but upon the mental plane. The absence of one kind of force cannot prevent the action of the others. Another instance, still more recently observed, was that of a materialist who, on awakening upon the astral plane after death, supposed himself to be still alive and merely experiencing an unpleasant dream. Fortunately for him, there was among the band of those able to function upon the astral plane a son of an old friend of his, who was commissioned to search for him and endeavour to render him some assistance. Naturally enough, he at first supposed the young man to be merely a figure in his dream, but upon receipt of a message from his old friend, referring to matters which had occurred before the death of the messenger, he was convinced of the reality of the plane upon which he found himself, and became at once exceedingly eager to acquire all possible information about it. The instruction which is being given to him under these conditions will undoubtedly have a very great effect upon him, and will largely modify not only the heaven life which lies before him, but also his next incarnation upon earth. What is shown to us by these two and by many other examples need not, after all, surprise us, for it is only what we might expect from our experience upon the physical plane. We constantly find down here that nature makes no allowance for our ignorance of her laws. If, under an impression that fire does not burn, a man puts his hand into a flame, he is speedily convinced of his mistake. In the same way, a man's disbelief in a future existence does not affect the facts of nature, and in some cases at least, he simply finds out after death that he was mistaken. The kind of materialism referred to by Madame Blavatsky in the remarks above mentioned was therefore probably something much coarser and more aggressive than ordinary agnosticism, something which would render it exceedingly unlikely that a man who held it would have any qualities requiring a life on the mental plane in which to work themselves out. Fifth subplane, the third heaven. The chief characteristic of this subdivision may be defined as devotion expressing itself in active work. The Christian on this plane, for example, instead of merely adoring his Saviour, would think of himself as going out into the world to work for him. It is especially the plane for the working out of great schemes and designs unrealized on earth, of great organizations inspired by religious devotion and usually having for their object some philanthropic purpose. It must be borne in mind, however, that ever as we rise higher, greater complexity and variety is introduced, so that, though we may still be able to give a definite characteristic as, on the whole, dominating the plane, we shall yet be more and more liable to find variations and exceptions that do not so readily range themselves under the general heading. A typical case, although somewhat above the average, was that of a man who was found carrying out a grand scheme for the amelioration of the condition of the lower classes. While a deeply religious man himself, he had felt that the first step necessary in dealing with the poor was to improve their physical condition, and the plan which he was now working out in his heaven life with triumphant success and loving attention to every detail was one which had often crossed his mind while on earth, though he had been quite unable there to take any steps towards its realization. His idea had been that, if possessed of enormous wealth, he would buy up and get into his own hands the whole of one of the smaller trades, one in which perhaps 3 or 4 large firms only were now engaged, and he thought that by so doing he could effect very large savings by doing away with competitive advertising and other wasteful forms of trade rivalry, and thus be able, while supplying goods to the public at the same price as now, to pay much better wages to his workmen. It was part of his scheme to buy a plot of land and erect upon it cottages for his workmen, each surrounded by its little garden, and after a certain number of years' service, each workman was to acquire a share in the profits of the business, which would be sufficient to provide for him in his old age. By working out this system, our philanthropist had hoped to show to the world that there was an eminently practical side to Christianity, and also to win the souls of his men to his own faith out of gratitude for the material benefits they had received. Another not dissimilar case was that of an Indian prince whose ideal on earth had been the divine hero king, Rama, on whose example he had tried to model his life and methods of government. Naturally, down here, all sorts of untoward accidents had occurred, and many of his schemes had consequently failed. But in the heaven life, everything went well, and the greatest possible result followed every one of his well-meant efforts. Rama, of course, personally advising and directing his work, and receiving perpetual adoration from all his devoted subjects. A curious and rather touching instance of personal religious work was that of a woman who had been a nun, belonging to one not of the contemplative, but of the working orders. She had evidently based her life upon the text, "Inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these, my brethren, ye have done it unto me." And now, in the heaven world, she was still carrying out to the fullest extent the injunctions of her Lord, and was constantly occupied in healing the sick, in feeding the hungry, and clothing and helping the poor. The peculiarity of the case being that each of those to whom she had ministered at once changed into the appearance of the Christ, whom she then worshipped with fervent devotion. An instructive case was that of 2 sisters, both of whom had been intensely religious. One of them had been a crippled invalid, and the other had spent a long life in tending her. On earth, they had often discussed and planned what religious and philanthropic work they would carry out if they were able, and now each is the most prominent figure in the heaven of the other, the cripple being well and strong, while each thinks of the other as joining her in carrying out the unrealized wishes of her earth life. This was a very fine example of the calm continuity of life in the case of people of unselfish aims. For the only difference that death had made was to eliminate disease and suffering, and to render easy the work which had heretofore been impossible. On this plane also the higher type of sincere and devoted missionary activity finds expression. Of course, the ordinary ignorant fanatic never reaches this level, but a few of the noblest cases, such as Livingstone, might be found here engaged in the congenial occupation of converting multitudes of people to the particular religion which they happened to advocate. One of the most striking of such cases which came under notice was that of a Mohammedan who imagined himself as working most zealously at the conversion of the world and its government according to the most approved principles of the faith of Islam. It appears that under certain conditions, artistic capacity may also bring its votaries to this subplane. But here, a careful distinction must be drawn. The artist or musician whose only object is the selfish one of personal fame, or who habitually allows himself to be influenced by feelings of professional jealousy, naturally generates no forces which will bring him to the mental plane at all. On the other hand, that grandest type of art, whose disciples regard it as a mighty power entrusted to them for the spiritual elevation of their fellows, will express itself in even higher regions than this. But between these two extremes, those devotees of art who follow it for its own sake, or regard it as an offering to their deity, never thinking of its effects on their fellows, may in some cases find their appropriate heaven on this subplane. As an example of this may be mentioned a musician of very religious temperament who regarded all his labor of love simply as an offering to the Christ and knew nothing of the magnificent arrangement of sound and color which his soul-inspiring compositions were producing in the matter of the mental plane. Nor would all his enthusiasm be wasted and fruitless, for without his knowledge it was bringing joy and help to many, and its results would certainly be to give him increased devotion and increased musical capacity in his next birth. But without the still wider aspiration to help humanity, this kind of heaven life might repeat itself almost indefinitely. Indeed, glancing back at the three planes with which we have just been dealing, we may notice that they are, in all cases, concerned with the working out of devotion to personalities, either to one's family and friends or to a personal deity, rather than the wider devotion to humanity for its own sake, which finds its expression on the next subplane. Fourth subplane, the fourth heaven. So varied are the activities of this, the highest of the Rupa levels, that it is difficult to group them under a single characteristic. Perhaps they might best be arranged into four main divisions: unselfish pursuit of spiritual knowledge, high philosophic or scientific thought, literary or artistic ability exercised for unselfish purposes, and service for the sake of service. The exact definition of each of these classes will be more readily comprehended when some examples of each have been given. Naturally, it is from those religions in which the necessity of obtaining spiritual knowledge is recognized that most of the population of this subplane is drawn. It will be remembered that on the sixth subplane we found many Buddhists whose religion had chiefly taken the form of devotion to their great leader as a person. Here, on the contrary, we have these more intelligent followers whose supreme aspiration was to sit at his feet and learn, who looked upon him in the light of a teacher rather than as a being to be adored. Now, in their heaven life, this highest wish is fulfilled. They find themselves in very truth learning from the Buddha, and the image which they have thus made of him is no empty form, but most assuredly through it shines out the wonderful wisdom, power, and love of that mightiest of earth's teachers. They are therefore acquiring fresh knowledge and wider views, and the effect upon their next life cannot but be of the most marked character. They will not perhaps remember any individual facts that they may have learnt, though when such facts are presented to their minds in a subsequent life, they will grasp them with avidity and intuitively recognize their truth. But the result of the teaching will be to build into the ego a strong tendency to take broader and more philosophical views on all such subjects. It will at once be seen how very definitely and unmistakably such a heaven life as this hastens the evolution of the ego, and once more our attention is drawn to the enormous advantage gained by those who have accepted the guidance of real, living, and powerful teachers. A less developed type of this form of instruction is found in cases in which some really great and spiritual writer has become to a student a living personality and has taken on the aspect of a friend, forming part of the student's mental life, an ideal figure in his musings. Such a one may enter into the pupil's heaven life, and by virtue of his own highly evolved soul, may vivify the mental image of himself, and under these happier circumstances, further illuminate the teachings in his own books, bringing out of them the more hidden meanings. Many of the followers of the path of wisdom among the Hindus find their heaven upon this plane, that is, if their teachers have been men possessing any real knowledge. A few of the more advanced among the Sufis and Parsis are also here, and we find some of the early Gnostics whose spiritual development was such as to earn for them a prolonged stay in this celestial region. But, except for this comparatively small number of Sufis and Gnostics, neither Mohammedanism nor Christianity seems to raise its followers to this level, though some who nominally belong to these religions may be carried on to this subplane by the presence in their character of qualities which do not depend upon the teachings peculiar to their religion. In this region, we also find earnest and devoted students of occultism who are not yet so far advanced as to have earned the right and the power to forego their heaven life for the good of the world. Among these was one who in life had been personally known to some of the investigators, a Buddhist monk, who had been an earnest student of Theosophy and had long cherished the hope of being one day privileged to receive instruction directly from its adept teachers. In his heaven life, the Buddha was the dominant figure, while the two masters, who have been most closely concerned with the Theosophical Society, appeared also as his lieutenants, expounding and illustrating his teaching. All three of these images were very full of the power and wisdom of the great beings whom they represented, and the monk was therefore definitely receiving real teaching upon occult subjects, the effect of which would almost certainly be to bring him actually onto the path of initiation in his next birth. Another instance from our ranks, which was encountered on this level, illustrates the terrible effect of harboring unfounded and uncharitable suspicions. It was the case of a devoted and self-sacrificing student who, towards the end of her life, had unfortunately fallen into an attitude of quite unworthy and unjustifiable distrust of the motives of her old friend and teacher, Madame Blavatsky. And it was sad to notice how this feeling had shut out to a considerable extent the higher influence and teaching which she might have enjoyed in her heaven life. It was not that the influence and teaching were in any way withheld from her, for that can never be, but that her own mental attitude rendered her to some extent unreceptive of them. She was of course quite unconscious of this, and seemed to herself to be enjoying the fullest and most perfect communion with the masters. Yet it was obvious to the investigators that but for this unfortunate self-limitation, she would have reaped far greater advantage from her stay on this level. A wealth of love and strength and knowledge almost infinite lay there at her hand, but her own ingratitude had sadly crippled her power to accept it. It will be understood that since there are other masters of wisdom beside those connected with our own movement and other schools of occultism working along the same general lines as to that which we belong, students attached to some of these are also frequently met with upon this subplane. Passing now to the next class, that of high philosophic and scientific thought, we find here many of those nobler and more unselfish thinkers who seek insight and knowledge only for the purpose of enlightening and helping their fellows. We are not including as students of philosophy those men, either in the East or the West, who waste their time in mere verbal argument and hair-splitting, for that is a form of discussion which has its roots in selfishness and conceit, and can therefore never help towards a real understanding of the facts of the universe. For naturally, such foolish superficiality as this produces no result that can work themselves out on the mental plane. As an instance of a true student noticed on this subplane, we may mention one of the later followers of the Neoplatonic system, whose name has fortunately been preserved to us in the surviving records of that period. He had striven all through his earth life, really to master the teachings of that school, and now his heaven life was occupied in unraveling its mysteries and in endeavoring to understand its bearing upon human life and development. Another case was that of an astronomer who seemed to have begun life as orthodox, but had gradually, under the influence of his studies, widened out into pantheism. In his heaven life, he was still pursuing these studies with a mind full of reverence, and was undoubtedly gaining real knowledge from those great orders of the Devas, through whom on this plane the majestic cyclic movement of the mighty stellar influences seems to express itself in ever-changing coruscations of all-penetrating living light. He was lost in contemplation of a vast panorama of whirling nebulae and gradually forming systems and worlds, and he appeared to be groping after some dim idea as to the shape of the universe, which he imagined as some vast animal. His thoughts surrounded him as elemental forms, shaped as stars, and one especial source of joy to him consisted in listening to the stately rhythm of the music that pealed out in mighty chorales from the moving orbs. The third type of activity on this plane is that highest kind of artistic and literary effort which is chiefly inspired by a desire to elevate and spiritualize the race. Here we find all our greatest musicians. On this subplane, Mozart, Beethoven, Bach, Wagner, and others are still flooding the heaven world with harmony far more glorious even than the grandest which they were able to produce when on earth. It seems as if a great stream of divine music poured into them from higher regions, and was, as it were, specialized by them and made their own, to be then sent forth through all the plane in a great tide of melody which adds to the bliss of all around. Those who are functioning in full consciousness on the mental plane will clearly hear and thoroughly appreciate this magnificent outpouring. But even the disembodied entities of this level, each of whom is wrapped up in his own thought cloud, are also deeply affected by the elevating and ennobling influence of its resonant melody. The painter and the sculptor also, if they have followed their respective arts always with a grand, unselfish aim, are here constantly making and sending forth all kinds of lovely forms for the delight and encouragement of their fellow men, the forms being simply artificial elementals created by their thought. And not only may these beautiful conceptions give deepest pleasure to those living entirely on the mental plane, they may also in many cases be grasped by the minds of artists still in the flesh, may act as inspirations to them, and so be reproduced down here for the elevating and ennobling of that portion of humanity which is struggling amid the turmoil of physical life. One touching and beautiful figure seen upon this plane was that of a boy who had been a chorister and had died at the age of 14. His whole soul was full of music and of boyish devotion to his art, deeply colored with the thought that by it he was expressing the religious longing of the multitude who crowded a vast cathedral, and yet was at the same time pouring out to them celestial encouragement and inspiration. He had known little enough, save for this one great gift of song, but he had used that gift worthily, trying to be the voice of the people to heaven, and of heaven to the people, and ever longing to know more music, and render it more worthily for the church's sake. And so, in this celestial life, his wish was bearing fruit, and over him was bending the quaint angular figure of a medieval Saint Cecilia, formed by his loving thought from the picture of her in a stained glass window. But though the outer garb was thus a scarcely artistic representation of a doubtful ecclesiastical legend, the reality which lay behind it was living and glorious, for the childish thought form was vivified by one of the mighty archangels of the celestial hierarchy of song, and through it he taught the chorister a grander strain of music than ever earth has known. Here also one of earth's failures, for the tragedy of the earth life leaves strange marks sometimes even in the heavenly places. In the world where all thoughts of loved ones smile upon man as friends. He was thinking and writing in solitude. On earth, he had striven to write a great book, and for the sake of it had refused to use his literary power in making mere sustenance from paltry hack work. But none would look at his book, and he walked the streets despairing, till sorrow and starvation closed his eyes to earth. He had been lonely all his life, in his youth friendless and shut out from family ties, and in his manhood able to work only in his own way, pushing aside hands that would have led him to a wider view of life's possibilities than the earthly paradise which he longed to make for all. Now, as he thought and wrote, though there were none whom he had loved as personal or ideal helpers who could make part of this his mental life, he saw stretching before him the utopia of which he had dreamed, for which he had tried to live, and the vast thronging impersonal multitudes whom he had longed to serve, and the joy of their joy surged back on him and made his solitude a heaven. When he is born again on earth, he will surely return with power to achieve as well as to plan, and this celestial vision will be partially bodied forth in happier terrene lives. Many were found on this plane who during their earth stay had devoted themselves to helping men because they felt the tie of brotherhood, who rendered service for the sake of service rather than because they desired to please any particular deity. They were engaged in working out with full knowledge and calm wisdom vast schemes of beneficence, magnificent plans of world improvement, and at the same time they were maturing powers with which to carry them out hereafter on the lower plane of physical life. The reality of the heaven life. Critics who have very imperfectly apprehended the theosophical teaching on the subject of the hereafter have sometimes urged that the life of the ordinary person in the lower heaven world is nothing but a dream and an illusion, that when he imagines himself happy amidst his family and friends, or carrying out his plans with such fullness of joy and success, he is really only the victim of a cruel delusion. And this is sometimes unfavorably contrasted with what is called the solid objectivity of the heaven promised by orthodoxy. The reply to such an objection is twofold. First, that when we are studying the problems of the future life, we are not concerned to know which of two hypotheses put before us would be the pleasanter, that being, after all, a matter of opinion, but rather which of them is the true one. And secondly, that when we inquire more fully into the facts of the case, we shall see that those who maintain the illusion theory are looking at the matter from quite a wrong point of view and have utterly misunderstood the facts. As to the first point, the actual state of affairs is quite easily discoverable by those who have developed the power to pass consciously onto the mental plane during life. And when so investigated, it is found to agree perfectly with the account given to us by the masters of wisdom through our great founder and teacher, Madame Blavatsky. This at once disposes of the solid objectivity theory mentioned above and transfers the onus of proof to the shoulders of our orthodox friends. As to the second point, if the contention be that on the lower levels of the heaven world, truth in its fullness is not yet known to man, and that consequently illusion still exists there, we must frankly admit that that is so. But that is not what is usually meant by those who bring forward this objection. They are generally oppressed by a feeling that the heaven life will be more illusory and useless than the physical, an idea than which nothing could be more entirely opposed to the fact. Is it contended that on that plane we make our own surroundings, and for that reason see only a very small part of the plane? Surely down here also the world of which a person is sensible is never the whole of the outer world, but only so much of it as his senses, his intellect, his education enable him to take in. It is obvious that during earth life, the average person's conception of everything around him is really quite a wrong one, empty, imperfect, inaccurate in a dozen ways. For what does he know of the great forces, etheric, astral, mental, which lie behind everything he sees, and in fact form by far the most important part of it? What does he know as a rule, even of the more recondite physical facts which surround him and meet him at every step that he takes? The truth is that here, as in his heaven life, he lives in a world which is very largely of his own creation. He does not realize it, either there or here, but that is only because of his own ignorance, because he knows no better. Is it said that in the heaven world a man takes his thoughts for real things? He is quite right. They are real things. And on this, the thought plane, nothing but thought can be real. There we recognize that great fact. Here we do not. On which plane then is the delusion greater? Those thoughts of his are indeed realities and are capable of producing the most striking results upon living men. Results which can never be otherwise than beneficial, because upon that high plane there can be none but loving thought. Thus it will be seen that the theory that the heaven life is an illusion is merely the result of a misconception and shows imperfect acquaintance with its conditions and possibilities. The truth is that the higher we rise, the nearer we draw to the one reality. It will perhaps assist the beginner to comprehend how real and how entirely natural is the higher portion of a man's life, if he regards it simply as the result of the earlier portion spent upon the two lower planes. We all know well that our highest ideals are never realized, that our highest aspirations never bear full fruit down here, so that it would seem as though in this way some efforts were fruitless, some force was lost. But we know that cannot be, for the law of the conservation of energy holds good on the higher planes just as on the lower. Much of that higher spiritual energy which man pours forth cannot react upon him while in earth life. For until his higher principles are freed from the incubus of the flesh, they are unable to respond to these far finer and more subtle vibrations. But in the heaven life, for the first time, all this hindrance is removed, and the accumulated energy immediately pours itself forth in the inevitable reaction which the law of eternal justice demands. As Browning has grandly phrased it, "There shall never be one lost good. What was shall live as before. The evil is null, is not. Is silence implying sound? What was good shall be good, with, for evil, so much good more. On the earth the broken arcs, in the heaven a perfect round. All we have willed or hoped or dreamed of good shall exist, not in its semblance but itself. No beauty, nor good, nor power, whose voice has gone forth, but each survives for the melodiest, when eternity affirms the conception of an hour. The high that proved too high, the heroic for earth too hard, the passion that left the ground to lose itself in the sky, are music sent up to God by the lover and the bard? Enough that he heard it once, we shall hear it by and by." Another point worth bearing in mind is that this system upon which nature has arranged the life after death is the only imaginable one which could fulfill its object of making everyone happy to the fullest extent of his capacity for happiness. If the joy of heaven were of one particular type only, as it is according to the orthodox theory, there must always be some who would weary of it, some who would be incapable of participating in it, either from want of taste in that particular direction or from lack of the necessary education, to say nothing of that other obvious fact that if this condition of affairs were eternal, the grossest injustice must be perpetrated by giving practically the same reward to all who enter, no matter what their respective deserts might be. Again, what other arrangement with regard to relatives and friends could possibly be equally satisfactory? If the departed were able to follow the fluctuating fortunes of their friends on earth, happiness would be impossible for them. If, without knowing what was happening to them, they had to wait until the death of those friends before meeting them, there would be a painful period of suspense, often extending over many years, while the friend would in many cases arrive so much changed as to be no longer sympathetic. On the system so widely provided for us by nature, every one of these difficulties is avoided. A man decides for himself both the length and the character of his heaven life by the causes which he himself generates during his earth life. Therefore, he cannot but have exactly the amount which he has deserved, and exactly that quality of joy which is best suited to his idiosyncrasies. Those whom he loves most he has ever with him, and always at their noblest and best, while no shadow of discord or change can ever come between them, since he receives from them all the time exactly what he wishes. In point of fact, the arrangement really made is infinitely superior to anything which the imagination of man has been able to offer us in its place. As indeed we might have expected, for all those speculations were man's idea of what is best, but the truth is God's idea. The renunciation of heaven. It has long been understood among students of occultism that among the possibilities of more rapid progress which come to a man as he advances in that of renouncing the reward of Devachan, as it has been called, that is, giving up the life of bliss in the heaven world between two incarnations in order to return more rapidly to carry on the work on the physical plane. The phrase quoted is not a very good one, for we shall be much more likely to arrive at a correct understanding of the heaven life if we look upon it as the necessary result of the earth life rather than as its reward. In the course of his physical existence, a man sets in motion by his higher thoughts and aspirations what may be described as a certain amount of spiritual force, which will react upon him when he reaches the mental plane. If there be but little of this force, it will be comparatively soon exhausted, and the heaven life will be a short one. If, on the contrary, a great deal has been generated, a corresponding space of time will be needed for its full working, and the heaven will be very greatly prolonged. As a man develops in spirituality, therefore, his lives in the heaven world will become longer, but it must not be supposed that his progress is thereby delayed or his opportunities of usefulness lessened. For all but very highly advanced persons, the heaven life is absolutely necessary, as it is only under its conditions that their aspirations can be developed into faculty, their experiences into wisdom, and the progress which is thus made by the soul is far greater than would be possible if by some miracle he was enabled to remain in physical incarnation for the entire period. If it were otherwise, obviously the whole law of nature would stultify itself, for the nearer it came to the attainment of its great object, the more determined and formidable would be its efforts to defeat itself. Hardly a reasonable view to take of a law which we know to be an expression of the most exalted wisdom. The possibility of the renunciation of this heaven life is by no means within the reach of every one. The great law permits no man to renounce blindly that of which he is ignorant, nor to depart from the ordinary course of evolution, unless and until it is certain that such departure will be for his ultimate benefit. The general rule is that no one is in a position to renounce the bliss of heaven until he has experienced it during earth life, until he is sufficiently developed to be able to raise his consciousness to that plane and bring back with him a clear and full memory of that glory which so far transcends terrestrial conception. A little thought will make obvious the reason and the justice of this. It might be said that since it is the progress of the soul which is really in question, it would be sufficient for him to understand on his own plane that the desirability of making the sacrifice of celestial bliss, and then to compel his lower self to act in accordance with his decision. Yet that would hardly be strict justice, for the enjoyment of heavenly bliss on the Rupa levels, though it belongs to the ego, belongs to him only as manifested through his personality. It is the life of that personality, with all its familiar personal surroundings, that is carried on in the lower heaven world. And so, before the renunciation of all this can take place, that personality must realize clearly what it is that is being given up. The lower mind must be in accord with the higher on this subject. Now, such realization obviously involves the possession during earth life of a consciousness on the mental plane equivalent to that which the person in question would have after death. But it must be remembered that the evolution of consciousness takes place from below upward, as it were, and that the comparatively undeveloped majority of mankind are effectively conscious as yet only in the physical body. Their astral bodies are, for the most part, still shapeless and unorganized, bridges of communication indeed between the ego and its physical vesture, and even vehicles for the reception of sensation, but in no sense as yet instruments in the hand of the real man, or adequate expressions of his future powers on that plane. In the more advanced races of mankind, we find the astral body much more developed, and the consciousness in it, in many cases, fairly complete potentially, though even then, in most cases, the man is entirely self-centered, conscious of his own thoughts mainly, and but little of his actual surroundings. To advance still further, some few of those who have taken up the study of occultism have been regularly awakened on that plane, and therefore entered upon the full use of their astral faculties, and are deriving in many ways great benefit therefrom. It does not, however, necessarily follow that such men should at first, or even for some considerable time, remember upon the physical plane the activities and experiences of their astral life. As a general rule, they would do so partially and intermittently, but there are cases in which, for various reasons, practically nothing worth calling a memory of that higher existence finds its way through into the physical brain. Any kind of definite consciousness on the mental plane would, of course, indicate still further advancement, and in the case of a man who was developing quite normally and regularly, we should expect to find such consciousness dawning only as the connection between the astral and the physical became fairly well established. But in this one-sided and artificial condition, which we call modern civilization, people do not always develop quite regularly and normally, and so there are cases to be found in which a considerable amount of consciousness on the mental plane has been acquired and duly linked on to the astral life, and yet no knowledge of all this higher existence ever gets through into the physical brain at all. Such cases are very rare, but they certainly do exist, and in them we see at once the possibility of an exception to our rule. A personality of this type might be sufficiently developed to taste the indescribable bliss of heaven, and so acquire the right to renounce it, while he was being able to bring the memory of it no farther down than into his astral life. But since, by the hypothesis that astral life would be one of full and perfect consciousness for the personality, such recollection would be amply sufficient to fulfill the requirements of justice, even though no shadow of all this ever came through into the physical waking consciousness. The great point to bear in mind is that since it is the personality that must resign, it is also the personality that must experience, and it must bring back the recollection to some plane on which it functions normally and in full consciousness. But that plane need not be the physical if these conditions are fulfilled upon the astral. Such a case would be unlikely to occur except among those who were already at least probationary pupils of one of the masters of wisdom. The man who wishes to perform this great feat must therefore work with the most intense earnestness to make himself a worthy instrument in the hands of those who help the world, must throw himself with the most devoted fervour into labour for the spiritual good of others, not arrogantly assuming that he is already fit for so great an honour, but rather humbly hoping that perhaps after a life or two of strenuous effort his master may tell him that the time has come when to him also this may be a possibility. The higher heaven world. We now turn from the 4 lower or rupa levels of the mental plane on which man functions in his temporary personality to the consideration of the 3 higher or arupa levels, his true and relatively permanent home. Here, so far as he sees at all, he sees clearly, for he has risen above the illusions of personality and the refracting medium of the lower self, and though his consciousness may be dim, dreamily unobservant and scarcely awake, yet his vision is at least true, however limited. The conditions of consciousness are so far away from all with which we are familiar down here that all terms known to psychology are useless and misleading. This has been called the realm of the nominal in contrast with the phenomenal, of the formless in contrast with the formed. But it is still a world of manifestation, however real when opposed to the unrealities of lower states, and it still has forms, however rare in their materials and subtle in their essence. After the period of what we usually call the heaven life is over, there is still another phase of existence for the soul before it is reborn on earth. And though in the case of most people this stage is a comparatively short one, we must not ignore it if we wish to have a complete conception of man's superphysical life. We are perpetually misunderstanding the life of man because we are in the habit of taking a partial view of it and entirely disregarding its real nature and object. We generally look at it, in fact, from the point of view of the physical body, and not in the least from that of the soul, and we therefore get the whole thing utterly out of proportion. Each movement of the ego towards these lower planes and back is in reality a vast circular sweep. We take a little fragment of the lower arc of this circle and regard it as a straight line, attaching quite undue importance to its beginning and ending, while the real turning point of the circle naturally entirely escapes us. Think of the matter for a moment as it must seem to the true man on his own plane, as soon as he begins to be at all clearly conscious there, in obedience to the desire for manifestation which he finds within him, which is impressed upon him by that law of evolution, which is the will of the Logos. He copies the action of that Logos by pouring himself forth into lower planes. In the course of this process, he clothes himself with matter of the various planes into which he passes, mental, astral, and physical in turn, all the while steadily pressing outward. Through the earlier part of that little fragment of existence on the physical plane, which we call his life, the outward force is still strong, but at about the middle of it, in ordinary cases, that force becomes exhausted, and the great inward sweep begins. Not that there is any sudden or violent change, for this is not an angle, but still part of the curve of the same circle, exactly corresponding to the moment of aphelion in a planet's course round its orbit. Yet it is the real turning point of that little cycle of evolution, though with us it is usually not marked in any way. In the old Indian scheme of life, it was marked as the end of the grihistha, or householder period of the man's earthly existence. From this point there should be nothing but a steady drawing inward of the whole force of the man, and his attention ought to be more and more withdrawn from mere earthly things, and concentrated on those of higher planes, from which we at once see how exceedingly ill adapted to real progress are the modern conditions of European life. The point at which the man drops his physical body is not a specially important one in this arc of evolution, by no means so important as the next change, which we might call his death on the astral plane and his birth in the heaven world, although really it is simply the transfer of the consciousness from astral matter to mental matter in the course of the same steady withdrawal, of which we have already spoken. The final result of the life is known only when in that process of withdrawal the consciousness is once more centered in the ego in his home in the higher heaven world. Then it is seen what new qualities he has acquired in the course of that particular little cycle of his evolution. At that time also a glimpse of the life as a whole is obtained. The soul has for a moment a flash of clearer consciousness, in which he sees the results of the life just completed, and something of what will follow from it in his next birth. This glimpse can hardly be said to involve a knowledge of the nature of the next incarnation, except in the vaguest and most general sense. No doubt the main object of the coming life would be seen, but the vision would be chiefly valuable to the soul as a lesson in the karmic result of his action in the past. It offers him an opportunity of which he takes more or less advantage according to the stage of development to which he has already attained. At first he makes little of it, since he is but very dimly conscious and very poorly fitted to apprehend facts and their varied interrelations. But gradually his power to appreciate what he sees increases, and later the ability comes to remember such flashes at the end of previous lives, and to compare them, and so to estimate the progress which he is making along the road which he has to traverse. Third subplane, the fifth heaven. This, the lowest of the Arupa subplanes, is also by far the most populous of all the regions with which we are acquainted, for here are present almost all the 60,000 millions of souls who are said to be engaged in the present human evolution. All, in fact, except the comparatively small number who are capable of functioning on the second and first subplanes. Each soul is represented by an ovoid form, at first a mere film, colorless and almost invisible, of most tenuous consistency, but as the ego develops, this body begins to show a shimmering iridescence, like a soap bubble, colors playing over its surface like the changing hues made by sunlight on the spray of a waterfall. Composed of matter inconceivably fine, delicate and ethereal, intensely alive and pulsating with living fire, it becomes, as its evolution proceeds, a radiant globe of flashing colors, its high vibrations sending ripples of changing hues over its surface, hues of which earth knows nothing, brilliant, soft and luminous, beyond the power of language to describe. Take the colors of an Egyptian sunset and add to them the wonderful softness of an English sky at eventide. Raise these as high above themselves in light and translucency and splendor as they are above the colors given by the cakes of a child's paint box, and even then none who have not seen can image the beauty of these radiant orbs which flash into the field of clairvoyant vision as it is lifted to the level of this supernal world. All these causal bodies are filled with living fire drawn from a higher plane, with which the globe appears to be connected by a quivering thread of intense light, vividly recalling to the mind the words of the stanzas of Dyson. The spark hangs from the flame by the finest thread of Fohat. And as the soul grows and is able to receive more and more from the inexhaustible ocean of the divine spirit which pours down through the thread as a channel, the latter expands and gives wider passage to the flood, till on the next subplane it might be imaged as a waterspout connecting earth and sky, and the still higher as itself a great globe through which rushes the living spring, until the causal body seems to melt into the inpouring light. Once more the stanza says it for us. The thread between the watcher and his shadow becomes more strong and radiant with every change. The morning sunlight has changed into noonday glory. This is thy present wheel, said the flame to the spark. Thou art myself, my image and my shadow. I have clothed myself in thee, and thou art my Vahan to the day. Be with us, when thou shalt re-become myself and others, thyself and me. The souls who are connected with a physical body are distinguishable from those enjoying the disembodied state by a difference in the types of vibrations set up on the surface of the globes, and it is therefore easy on this plane to see at a glance whether an individual is or is not in incarnation at the time. The immense majority, whether in or out of the body, are but dreamily semi-conscious, though few are now in the condition of mere colourless films. Those who are fully awake are marked and brilliant exceptions, standing out amid the less radiant crowds like stars of the first magnitude. And between these and the least developed are ranged every variety of size and beauty of colour, each thus representing the exact stage of evolution at which he has arrived. The majority are not yet sufficiently definite, even in such consciousness as they possess, to understand the purpose or the laws of the evolution in which they are engaged. They seek incarnation in obedience to the impulse of the cosmic will, and also to tanha, the blind thirst for manifested life, a desire to find some region in which they can feel and be conscious of living. For in their earlier stages, these undeveloped souls cannot feel the intensely rapid and piercing vibrations of the highly refined matter of their own plane. The strong and coarse but comparatively slow movements of the heavier matter of the physical plane are the only ones that can evoke any response from them. So, it is only upon the physical plane that they feel themselves to be alive at all, and this explains their strong craving for rebirth into earth life. Thus, for the time, their desire agrees exactly with the law of their evolution. They can develop only by means of these impacts from without, to which they are gradually roused to respond, and in this early stage, they can receive them only in earth life. By slow degrees their power of response increases and is awakened first to the higher and finer of the physical vibrations, and still more slowly to those of the astral plane. Then their astral bodies, which until now have been merely bridges to convey sensations to the soul, gradually become definite vehicles which they can use, and their consciousness begins to be centered rather in their emotions than in mere physical sensations. At a later stage, but always by the same process of learning to respond to impacts from without, the souls learn to center their consciousness in the mental body, to live in and according to the mental images they have formed for themselves, and so to govern their emotions by the mind. Yet further on the long, long road, the center shifts to the causal body, and the souls realize their true life. When that time comes, they will be found upon a higher subplane than this, and the lower earthly existence will be no longer necessary for them. But for the present, we are thinking of the less evolved majority, who still put forth as groping, waving tentacles into the ocean of existence, the personalities which are themselves on the lower planes of life. Though they are as yet in no sense aware that these personalities are the means whereby they are to be nourished and to grow, they see nothing of their past or their future, not being yet conscious on their own plane, Still, as they are slowly drawing in experience and assimilating it, there grows up a sense that certain things are good to do and others bad, and this expresses itself imperfectly in the connected personality as the beginning of a conscience, a feeling of right and wrong, and gradually, as they develop, this sense more and more clearly and clearly formulates itself in the lower nature and becomes a less inefficient guide of conduct. By means of the opportunities given by the flash of fuller consciousness to which we have previously referred, the most advanced souls of this subplane develop to a point at which they are engaged in studying their past, tracing out the causes set going in it, and learning much from the retrospection, so that the impulses sent downwards become clearer and more definite, and translate themselves in the lower consciousness as firm convictions and imperative intuitions. It is perhaps scarcely necessary to repeat that the thought images of the Rupa levels are not carried into the higher heaven world. All illusion now is past, and each soul knows his real kindred, sees them, and is seen in his own royal nature, as the true immortal man that passes on from life to life, with all the ties intact that are knit to his real being. Second subplane, the sixth heaven. From the densely thronged region which we have been considering, we pass into a more thinly populated world, as out of a great city into a peaceful countryside. For at the present stage of human evolution, only a small minority of individuals have risen to this loftier level, where even the least advanced is definitely self-conscious and also conscious of his surroundings, able at least to some extent to review the past through which he has come. The soul on this level is aware of the purpose and method of evolution. He knows that he is engaged in a work of self-development and recognizes the stages of physical and post-mortem life through which he passes in his lower vehicles. The personality with which he is connected is seen by him as part of himself, and he endeavors to guide it, using his knowledge of the past as a store of experience from which he formulates principles of conduct, clear and immutable convictions of right and wrong. These he sends down into his lower mind, superintending and directing its activities. While he continually fails in the earlier part of his life on this subplane to make the lower mind understand logically the foundations of the principles he impresses on it, he yet very definitely succeeds in making the impression, and such abstract ideas as truth, justice, and honor become unchallenged and ruling conceptions in the lower mental life. There are rules of conduct enforced by social, national, and religious sanctions by which a man guides himself in daily life, which may yet be swept away by some rush of temptation, some overmastering surge of passion and desire. But there are some things an evolved man cannot do, things which are against his very nature. He cannot lie or betray or do a dishonorable action. Into the inmost fibers of his being, certain principles are wrought, and to act against them is an impossibility, no matter what may be the strain of circumstance or the torrent of temptation. For these things are of the life of the soul. While, however, he thus succeeds in guiding his lower vehicle, his knowledge of it and its doing is often far from precise and clear. He sees the lower planes but dimly, understanding their principles rather than their details, and part of his evolution on this plane consists of coming more and more consciously into direct touch with the personality, which so imperfectly represents him below. It will be understood from this that only such souls as are deliberately aiming at spiritual growth live on this plane, and they have in consequence become largely receptive of influences from the planes above them. The channel of communication grows and enlarges, and a fuller flood pours through. The thought under this influence takes on a singularly clear and piercing quality, even in the less developed, and the effect of this in the lower mind shows itself as a tendency to philosophic and abstract thinking. In the more highly evolved, the vision is far-reaching. It ranges with clear insight over the past, recognizing the causes set up, their working out, and what remains still unexhausted of their effects. The souls living on this plane have wide opportunities for growth when freed from the physical body, for here they may receive instructions from more advanced entities, coming into direct touch with their teachers, no longer by thought pictures, but by a flashing luminousness impossible to describe. The very essence of the idea flies like a star from one soul to the other, its correlations expressing themselves as light waves pouring out from the central star and needing no separate enunciation. A thought is like a light placed in a room. It shows all things round it, but requires no words to describe them. First subplane, the seventh heaven. This, the most glorious level of the mental world, has but few denizens as yet from our humanity. For on its heights dwell none but the masters of wisdom and compassion, and their initiated pupils, of the beauty of form and colour and sound. Here no words can speak, for mortal language has no terms in which those radiant splendours may find expression. Enough that they are, and that some of our race are wearing them, the earnest of what others shall be, the fruition of which the seeds was sown on lowlier plains. These have accomplished the mental evolution, so that in them the higher shines out ever through the lower. From their eyes the illusion veil of personality has been lifted, and they know and realize that they are not the lower nature, but only use it as a vehicle of experience. It may still have power in the less evolved of them to shackle and to hamper, but they can never fall into the blunder of confusing the vehicle with the self behind it. From this they are saved by carrying their consciousness through unbroken, not only from day to day, but from life to life, so that past lives are not so much looked back upon as always present in the consciousness, the man feeling them as one life rather than as many. At this height, the soul is conscious of the lower heaven world as well as of his own, and if he has any manifestations there as a thought form in the heaven life of his friends, he can make the fullest use of them. On the third subplane, and even in the lower part of the second, his consciousness of the subplanes below him was still dim, and his action in the thought form largely instinctive and automatic. But as soon as he got well into the second subplane, his vision rapidly became clearer, and he recognized the thought forms with pleasure as vehicles through which he was able to express more of himself in certain ways than he could through his personality. Non-human. When we attempt to describe the non-human inhabitants of the mental plane, we at once find ourselves face to face with difficulties of the most insuperable character. For in touching the seventh heaven, we come into contact for the first time with a plane which is cosmic in its extent, on which, therefore, may be met many an entity which mere human language has no words to portray. For the purposes of our present paper, it will probably be best to put aside altogether those vast hosts of beings whose range is cosmic and confine our remarks strictly to the inhabitants peculiar to the mental plane of our own chain of worlds. It may be remembered that in the manual on the astral plane, the same course was adopted, no attempt being made to describe visitors from other planets and systems. And although such visitors as were there only occasional would here be very much more frequent, it seems best in this case also to adhere to the same rule. A few words, therefore, upon the elemental essence of the plane and the section of the great Deva kingdom which are especially connected with it will be as much as it will be useful to give here, and the extreme difficulty of presenting even these comparatively simple ideas will conclusively show how impossible it would be to deal with others which could not but be far more complicated. The elemental essence. It may be remembered that in one of the earlier letters received from an adept teacher, the remark was made that to comprehend the condition of the first and second of the elemental kingdoms was impossible except to an initiate, an observation which shows how partial must be the success which can attend any effort to describe them down here upon the physical plane. It will be well first of all that we should endeavour to form as clear an idea in our minds as possible of what elemental essence really is, since this is a point upon which much confusion often seems to exist, even amongst those who have made considerable study of theosophical literature. What it is. Elemental essence, then, is merely a name applied during certain early stages of its evolution to the monadic essence, which in its turn may be defined as the outpouring of the divine life from the second logos into matter. We are all familiar with the fact that before this outpouring arrives at the stage of individualization at which it forms the causal body of a man, it has passed through and ensouled, in turn, 6 lower phases of evolution: the animal, vegetable, mineral, and 3 elemental kingdoms. When energizing through those respective stages, it has sometimes been called the animal, vegetable, or mineral monad, although this term is distinctly misleading, since long before it arrives at any of these kingdoms, it has become not one but many monads. The name was, however, adopted to convey the idea that, though differentiation in the monadic essence had already long ago set in, it has not yet been carried to the extent of individualization. Now, when this monadic essence is energizing through the 3 great elemental kingdoms which precede the mineral, it is called by the name of elemental essence. The veiling of the spirit. Before, however, the nature of the monadic essence and the manner in which it manifests itself on the various planes can be understood, the method in which spirit enfolds itself in its descent into matter must be realized. We are not now dealing with the original formation of the matter of the planes, but simply with the descent of a new wave of evolution into matter already existing. Before the period of which we are speaking, this wave of life has spent countless ages evolving in a manner of which we can have very little comprehension, through the successive encasements of atoms, molecules, and cells. But we will leave all that earlier part of its stupendous history out of account for the moment, and consider only its descent into the matter of planes somewhat more within the grasp of human intellect, though still far above the merely physical level. Be it understood, then, that when spirit, resting on any plane, it matters not which, on its path downward into matter, is driven by the resistless force of its own evolution to pass onward to the plane next below, it must, in order to manifest itself there, enfold itself in at least the atomic matter of that lower plane, draw round itself as a body a veil of that matter to which it will act as soul or energizing force. Similarly, when it continues its descent to a third plane, it must draw round itself some of its matter, and we shall have then an entity whose body or outer covering consists of the atomic matter of the third plane. But the force energizing in this entity, its soul, so to speak, will not be spirit in the condition in which it was upon the higher plane on which we first found it. It will be that spirit plus the veil of the atomic matter of the second plane through which it has passed. When a still further descent is made to a fourth plane, the entity becomes still more complex, for it will then have a body of the matter of that fourth plane, ensouled by spirit already twice veiled in the atomic matter of the second and third planes. It will be seen that since this process repeats itself for each plane of the solar system, by the time the original force reaches our physical level, it is so thoroughly veiled that it is small wonder that men often fail to recognize it as spirit at all. For example, let us suppose the ordinary untrained clairvoyant trying to investigate the mineral monad, to examine the life force behind the mineral kingdom. The sight of such a one would be practically certain to be limited to the astral plane. and would quite probably be exceedingly imperfect even there. So to him that force would appear simply astral. But a trained student examining it with higher power would see that what the clairvoyant had taken for astral force was merely astral atomic matter, set in motion by a force coming thither from the atomic part of the mental plane. The more advanced student would be able to see that that atomic mental matter in its turn was only a vehicle in which something from the highest Buddhic subplane was working, while the adept would perceive that the Buddhic matter was but the vehicle of the Nirvanic, and that the force which entered into and worked through all these successive veils came in reality from outside this cosmic Prakritic plane altogether, and was in truth simply one of the manifestations of the divine force. The elemental kingdoms. The elemental essence which we find on the mental plane constitutes the first and second of the great elemental kingdoms. A wave of the divine life, having finished in some previous eon its downward evolution through the Buddhic plane, pours down into the seventh heaven and ensouls great masses of the atomic mental matter, thus becoming the elemental essence of the first great kingdom. In this, its simplest condition, it does not combine the atoms into molecules in order to form a body for itself, but simply applies by its attraction an immense compressing force to them. We may imagine the force, on first reaching this plane on its downward swoop, to be entirely unaccustomed to its vibrations and unable at first to respond to them. During the eon which it spends on this level, its evolution will consist in accustoming itself to vibrate at all rates which are possible there, so that at any moment it can ensoul and use any combination of the matter of that plane. During this long period of evolution, it will have taken upon itself all possible combinations of the matter of the three arupa levels. But at the end of the time, it returns to the atomic level, not of course as it was before, but bearing latent within it all the powers which it has gained. In the succeeding eon, it pours itself down into the fourth subplane of the mental, that is to say, the highest of the rupa levels, and draws to itself as a body some of the matter of that subdivision. It is then the elemental essence of the second kingdom in its simplest condition, but as before, in the course of its evolution, it takes on garbs many and various, composed of all possible combinations of the matter of the lower subplanes. It might naturally be supposed that these elemental kingdoms, which exist and function upon the mental plane, must certainly, being so much higher, be further advanced in evolution than the third kingdom, which belongs exclusively to the astral plane. This, however, is not so, for it must be remembered that in speaking of this phase of evolution, the word higher means not, as usual, more advanced, but less advanced, since here we are dealing with the monadic essence on the downward sweep of its arc, and progress for the elemental essence, therefore, means descent into matter, instead of, as with us, ascent towards higher planes. Unless the student bears this fact constantly and clearly in mind, he will again and again find himself beset by perplexing anomalies, and his view of this side of evolution will be lacking in grasp and comprehensiveness. The general characteristics of elemental essence were indicated at considerable length in the manual on the astral plane, and all that is there said as to the number of subdivisions in the kingdoms and their marvelous impressibility by human thought is equally true of these celestial varieties. A few words should perhaps be said to explain how the 7 horizontal subdivisions of each kingdom arrange themselves in connection with the various parts of the mental plane. In the case of the first kingdom, its highest subdivision corresponds with the first subplane, while the second and third subplanes are each divided into 3 parts, each of which is the habitat of one of the elemental subdivisions. The second kingdom distributes itself over the lower heaven world, its highest subdivision corresponding to the 4th subplane, while the 5th, 6th and 7th subplanes are each divided into 2 to accommodate the remainder. How the essence evolves. So much was written in the earlier part of this manual as to the effect of thought upon the mental elemental essence that it will be unnecessary to return to that branch of the subject now. But it must be borne in mind that it is, if possible, even more instantaneously sensitive to thought action here than it is on the astral plane. The wonderful delicacy with which it responds to the faintest action of the mind being constantly and prominently brought before our investigators. We shall grasp this capability the more fully if we realize that it is in such response that its very life consists, that its progress is greatly helped by the use made of it in the process of thought by the more advanced entities whose evolution it shares. If it could be imagined as entirely free for a moment from the action of thought, it would appear as a formless conglomeration of dancing, infinitesimal atoms. Instinct indeed with a marvelous intensity of life, yet probably making but little progress on the downward path of its involution into matter. But when thought seizes upon it and stirs it into activity, throwing it on the Rupa levels into all kinds of lovely forms, and on the Arupa levels into flashing streams, it receives a distinct additional impulse, which, often repeated, helps it forward on its way. For whenever a thought is directed from those higher levels to the affairs of earth, it naturally sweeps downward and takes upon itself the matter of the lower planes. In doing so, it brings into contact with that matter, the elemental essence of which its first veil was formed, and so by degrees habituates that essence to answering to lower vibrations, and this greatly assists its downward evolution into matter. Very noticeably also is it affected by music, by the splendid floods of glorious sound of which we have previously spoken as poured forth upon these lofty plains by the great masters of melody, who are carrying on there in far fuller measure the work which down here on this dull earth they had only commenced. Another point which should be remembered is the vast difference between the grandeur and power of thought on this plane and the comparative feebleness of the efforts that we dignify with that name down here. Our ordinary thought begins in the mind-body on the lower mental levels and clothes itself as it descends with the appropriate astral elemental essence. But when a man has advanced so far as to have his consciousness active in the true self in the higher heaven world, his thought commences there and clothes itself first in the elemental essence of the lower levels of the mental plane, and is consequently infinitely finer, more penetrating, and in every way more effective. If the thought be directed exclusively to higher objects, its vibrations may be of too fine a character to find expression on the astral plane at all. But when they do affect this lower matter, they will do so with much more far-reaching effect than those which are generated so much nearer to its own level. Following this idea a stage further, we see the thought of the initiate taking its rise upon the Buddhic plane, above the mental world altogether, and clothing itself with the elemental essence of the highest heavens for garment, while the thought of the adept pours down from nirvana itself, wielding the tremendous, the wholly incalculable powers of regions beyond the ken of mere ordinary humanity. Thus, ever as our conceptions rise higher, we see before us wider and wider fields of usefulness for our enormously increased capacities, and we realize how true is the saying that the work of one day on levels such as these may well surpass in efficiency the toil of 1,000 years on the physical plane. The Animal Kingdom. The animal kingdom is represented on the mental plane by two main divisions. In the lower heaven world, we find the group souls to which the vast majority of animals are attached, and on the third subplane, the causal bodies of the comparatively few members of the kingdom who are yet individualized. These latter, however, are not, strictly speaking, animals any longer. They are practically the only examples now to be seen of the quite primitive causal body, undeveloped in size and as yet colored only very faintly by the first vibrations of newly born qualities. After his deaths on the physical and astral planes, the individualized animal has usually a very prolonged, though often somewhat dreamy life in the lower heaven world. His condition during that time is analogous to that of the human being on the same level, though with far less mental activity. He is surrounded by his own thought forms, even though he may be but dreamily conscious of them, and these are sure to include the forms of his earth friends in their very best and most sympathetic moods. And since the love which is strong enough and unselfish enough to form such an image must also be strong enough to reach the soul of the loved one and draw a response from him, even the pets upon whom our kindness is lavished may do their little trifle in return towards helping on our evolution. When the individualized animal retires into his causal body to await the turn of the wheel of evolution, which shall give him the opportunity of a primitive human incarnation, he seems to lose almost all consciousness of outer things, and to spend the time in a sort of delightful trance of the deepest peace and contentment. Even then, interior development of some sort is surely taking place, though its nature is difficult for us to comprehend. But at least it is certain that for every entity which comes into connection with it, whether he be only just entering upon human evolution or preparing to pass beyond it, the heaven world means the highest bliss of which that entity is at its level capable. The Devas or angels. But little can be expressed in human language about these wonderful and exalted beings, and most of what we know of them has already been written in the astral plane. For the information of those who have not that manual at hand, I will repeat here somewhat of the general explanation there given with reference to these entities. The highest system of evolution, specially connected with this earth, so far as we know, is that of the beings whom Hindus call the Devas, and who have elsewhere been spoken of as angels, sons of God, etc. They may, in fact, be regarded as a kingdom lying next above humanity, in the same way as humanity in turn lies next above the animal kingdom, but with this important difference, that while for an animal there is no possibility of evolution through any kingdom but the human, man, when he attains the level of the Ashekha, or full adept, finds various paths of advancement opening before him, of which this great Deva evolution is only one. In Oriental literature, this word Deva is frequently used vaguely to mean almost any kind of non-human entity, so that it would often include the highest of the spiritual powers on the one hand, and nature spirits and artificial elementals on the other. Here, however, its use will be restricted to the magnificent evolution which we are now considering. Though connected with this earth, these angels are by no means confined to it, for the whole of our present chain of 7 worlds is as one world to them, their evolution being through a grand system of 7 chains. Their hosts have hitherto been recruited chiefly from other humanities in the solar system, some lower and some higher than ours, since but a very small portion of our own has as yet reached the level at which for us it is possible to join them. But it seems certain that some of their very numerous classes have not passed in their upward progress through any humanity at all comparable with ours. It is not possible for us at present to understand very much about them, but it is clear that what may be described as the aim of their evolution is considerably higher than ours. That is to say, while the object of our human evolution is to raise the successful portion of humanity to the position of the Ashekha, adept, by the end of the 7th round, the object of the Deva evolution is to raise their foremost rank to a very much higher level in the corresponding period. For them, as for us, a steeper but shorter path to still more sublime heights lies open to earnest endeavor. But what those heights may be in their case, we can only conjecture. Their divisions. Their 3 lower grade divisions, beginning from the bottom, are generally called Kama Devas, Rupa Devas, and Arupa Devas, which may be translated as angels of the astral world, the lower heaven world, and the higher heaven world, respectively. Just as our ordinary body here, the lowest body possible for us, is the physical, so the ordinary body of a Kamadeva is the astral, so that he stands in somewhat the same position as humanity will do when it reaches planet F, and he, living ordinarily in an astral body, would go out of it to higher spheres in a mental body, just as we might in an astral body, while to enter the causal body would be to him, when sufficiently developed, no greater effort than to use the same mental body might be to us. In the same way, the Rupadeva's ordinary body would be the mental, since his habitat is the 4 Rupa levels of the mental plane, while the Arupa Deva belongs to the 3 higher levels of that plane and owns no denser body than the causal. Above the Rupa Devas, there are 4 other great classes of this kingdom, inhabiting respectively the 4 higher planes of our solar system. And again, above and beyond the Deva kingdom altogether, stand the great hosts of the planetary spirits, but the consideration of such glorified beings would be out of place here. Each of the 2 great divisions of this kingdom which have been mentioned as inhabiting the mental plane contains within itself many different classes. But their life is in every way so far removed from our own that it is useless to endeavor to give anything but the most general idea of it. I do not know that I can better indicate the impression produced upon the minds of our investigators on the subject than by reproducing the very words used by one of them at the time of the inquiry. I get the effect of an intensely exalted consciousness, a consciousness glorious beyond all words, yet so very strange, so different, so entirely different from anything I have ever felt before. So unlike any possible kind of human experience that it is absolutely hopeless to try to put it into words. Equally hopeless is it on this physical plane to try to give any idea of the appearance of these mighty beings, for it changes with every line of thought which they follow. Some reference was made earlier in this paper to the magnificence and wonderful power of expression of their color language, and it will also have been realized from some passing remarks made in describing the human inhabitants that under certain conditions it is possible for men functioning upon this plane to learn much from them. It may be remembered how one of them had animated the angel figure in the heaven life of a chorister and was teaching him music grander far than any ever heard by earthly ears, and how in another case those connected with the wielding of certain planetary influences were helping forward the evolution of a certain astronomer. Their relation to the nature spirits, for an account of whom see Manual 5, might be described as somewhat resembling, though on a higher scale, that of men to the animal kingdom. For just as the animal can attain individualization only by association with man, so it appears that a permanent reincarnating individuality can normally be acquired by a nature spirit only by an attachment of somewhat similar character to members of some of the orders of Devas. Of course, nothing that has been, or indeed can be said, of this great angelic evolution does more than brush the fringe of a very mighty subject, the fuller elaboration of which it must be left to each reader to make for himself when he develops the consciousness of these higher planes. Yet, what has been written, slight and unsatisfactory as it is and must be, may help to give some faint idea of the hosts of helpers with which man's advance in evolution will bring him into touch, and to show how every aspiration which his increased capacities make possible for him as he ascends is more than satisfied by the beneficent arrangements which nature has made for him. Artificial. Very few words need be said upon this branch of our subject. The mental plane is even more fully peopled than the astral by the artificial elementals called into temporary existence by the thoughts of its inhabitants. And when it is remembered how much grander and more powerful thought is upon this plane, and that its forces are being wielded not only by the human inhabitants, embodied and disembodied, but by the Devas and by visitors from higher planes, it will at once be seen that the importance and influence of such artificial entities can hardly be exaggerated. It is not necessary here to go over again the ground traversed in the previous manual as to the effect of men's thoughts and the necessity of guarding them carefully, and enough was said in describing the difference between the action of thought on the rupa and arupa levels to show how the artificial elemental of the mental plane is called into existence, and to give some idea of the infinite variety of temporary entities which are so produced, and the immense importance of the work that is constantly done by their means. Great use is made of them by adepts and their initiated pupils. And it is needless to say that the artificial elemental formed by such powerful minds as these is a being of infinitely longer existence and proportionately greater power than any of those described in dealing with the astral plane. Conclusion. In glancing over what has been written, the prominent idea is not unnaturally a humiliating sense of the utter inadequacy of all the attempts at description, of the hopelessness of any effort to put into human words the ineffable glories of the heaven world. Still, lamentably imperfect as such an essay as this must be, it is yet better than nothing, and it may serve to put into the mind of the reader some faint conception of what awaits him on the other side of the grave. And though, when he reaches this bright realm of bliss, he will certainly find infinitely more than he has been led to expect, he will not, it is hoped, have to unlearn any of the information that he has here acquired. Man, as at present constituted, has within him principles belonging to two planes even higher than the mental, for his buddhi represents him upon what, from that very fact, we call the buddhic plane, and his atma, the divine spark within him, upon that third plane of the solar system, which has usually been spoken of as the nirvanic. In the average man, these highest principles are as yet almost entirely undeveloped, and in any case the planes to which they belong are still more beyond the reach of all description than is the mental. It must suffice to say that on the buddhic plane all limitations begin to fall away, and the consciousness of man expands until he realizes, no longer in theory only, but by absolute experience, that the consciousness of his fellows is included within his own. And he feels and knows and experiences with an absolute perfection of sympathy all that is in them, because it is in reality a part of himself, while on the nirvanic plane he moves a step further and realizes that his consciousness and theirs are one in a yet higher sense, because they are all in reality facets of the infinitely greater consciousness of the Logos, in whom they all live and move and have their being, so that when the dewdrop slips into the shining sea, the effect produced is rather as though the process had been reversed, and the ocean poured into the drop, which now for the first time realizes that it is the ocean, not a part of it, but the whole. Paradoxical, utterly incomprehensible, apparently impossible, yet absolutely true. But this much at least we may grasp, that the blessed state of nirvana is not, as some have ignorantly supposed, a condition of blank nothingness, but of far more intense and beneficent activity, and that ever as we rise higher in the scale of nature our possibilities become greater, our work for others even grander and more far-reaching, and that infinite wisdom and infinite power means only infinite capacity for service, because they are directed by infinite love. End of the book, The Devachanic Plane, by C.W. Leadbeater. Second edition, revised and enlarged, The Theosophical Publishing Society, London and Benares, 1902.